Hello and welcome to the Michael Mamas Show. I'm your host, Michael Mamas, and we're coming to you from Mount Soma, home of the Sri Someshwara Temple in the mountains of western North Carolina, where it's been rainy lately. I thought there are just a couple little things I wanted to bring up before we really get into the meat of the broadcast today. And one of them is I was, looking at the world situation and, fears of economic collapse in the United States and the whole global situation. And I just had the thought, Scotty, that, with all the printing of money and everything, they're looking at the U.S. economy being weak and huge inflation and all that. And well, for one, if you look at inflation, really it's, people think of inflation as the price of things going up. And really that's generally the side effect of inflation. But inflation just means inflation in the size, increase in the amount of money in circulation. And so as a result of that, and this takes us back, Scott, to that class. Were you at that class in Black Mountain, Scotty, where we talked about, I don't think you were there, supply and demand. I tried to explain supply and demand.
Yeah,
They're all upset. And I learned just recently that, that is the fundamental. If there's one fundamental principle in economics, it would be supply and demand, right?
sure.
But I heard there was the economics professor that was saying that not even all economic students even understand supply and demand, which is just basically the more you have of something, the less it's worth because it's everywhere instead of being rare,
Right.
But at any rate, then that speaks to money as well as it does to bushels of corn, But here's the thing: it's not just supply; it's also supply and demand. And we've printed a whole bunch of money, and that's why its value has gone down. So it takes more money to buy groceries. But that's happening all over the world. The currency of China is really in bad shape. The currency of Russia, Canada, all of Western Europe and Eastern Europe. It's a global phenomenon now, but all these currencies are having all kinds of trouble. And so in fact, in contrast to all the other currencies, the dollar is probably the most stable, as big a mess as it's in right now.
It's the best of a bad lot.
It's the best of a bad lot.
Yeah.
And so what that does is so people who are globally oriented financially, where are they going to go with their currency? Where are they going to go? They're going to go into the dollar. And what's that going to do? It's going to drive up the price. And if things continue the way they're going, if you read about the economy of Russia, the economy of China, they're hurting so bad that they could really, really tumble, in which case the dollar is going to surge, in which case you could have a scenario kind of like post-World War II when the U.S. was just right on top. And that could happen again. And so even though there's more money out there in the money supply, the dollar ends up being really, really, really strong. And I think that's a possible scenario. I didn't say much about it, though I've been thinking that way, until I heard there's this financial expert, and I don't really listen to his stuff, even though I respect him a lot, but I somehow stumbled across a broadcast. So I listened to the last 2 or 3 minutes of it, just out of curiosity, going there and where he's at right now. Usually they summarize things at the end. And son of a gun, he's saying exactly the same thing. And then there's another, what was it? There's another interesting point here that has to do with all that.
By the way, that may be the real war that's going on. The currency war.
The currency war is the real war. but people don't really understand that very well.
No, there's so many.
Yeah, they would rather talk about what's got the border crisis or
Yeah,
all the fentanyl pouring in. All those are important things.
right.
But the real strength of a nation ultimately boils down to the strength of the currency, which is something that people can't relate to, and don't even want to think that way, and can't think that way.
Because who really controls all that? What really are the buttons that are being pushed to do all that? Nobody knows. Yeah.
Yeah, to control the currency. But now, George Soros, who we've talked about before, he's very well aware. In fact, he's very into currencies and following currencies. And he's made tons of money by speculating on, if the currency is going to go down or go up. And I don't know if this is true. I don't know that much about it, but it does make sense to me. They do know that Soros and Zelensky, president of Ukraine, Soros worked with him, propped him up, and by virtue then of the conflict, and he's done this kind of thing before Soros, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia has really affected the currencies certainly of Russia and of other nations. And so evidently Soros has made tons of money just playing those fluctuations. And I even saw a video of Soros where he says that he doesn't pay any attention to the moral aspects of what he does. He's purely for the money, which is difficult to even comprehend, that somebody would not only do that, but actually admit to it,
It's just still baffling that, from this guy. I mean, is he 90 or he's not 80 some years old? It's
He's
like,
old.
what's he doing all this for? What is it that he's, it's not like he's going to go out and,
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but at some point it just becomes what they do.
that's his
People
legacy.
have a life, and that's what they do with their life, and that's what they do. And then they develop their biases, their rage, their wrathfulness,
Yeah.
and they become addicted to it, Yeah. So currency is a huge major factor in the whole thing, but particularly in election years, that's not what they play. They play the stuff that'll get votes. The other thing is, and this is an interesting thing, some nations are basically commodity nations. What that means is that they're not really highly industrialized or anything. They are industrialized somewhat, but not highly industrialized. Where their money is really coming from is their commodities. For example, Russia is considered a commodity nation. Oil. They produce oil. And though strictly speaking, what China's doing, we wouldn't call it a commodity per se. You could still look at all the stuff they're selling to Walmart and to the United States and all. It's essentially works the same way. It's a commodity in the sense that, be it oil from Russia or be it merchandise from China, both of those situations are dependent. Both of those nations to bring in money are dependent upon industrialized nations. Basically, China is completely dependent on the United States. If the United States stopped buying goods from China, China would be in huge trouble. Similarly, now with respect to oil, Western Europe, they're talking about boycotting Russian oil. If that happens, Russia is in huge trouble. Now, India is still buying gas and oil from Russia because there's nowhere else to get it. And some people have, I think it's possible that even Biden tried to get India to not buy petroleum products from Russia. But they're not going to do that because they need it for their people to live,
Well, it's the same with Europe
Well,
too.
hang on. The point here is though, and I think this is about what you were about to say, maybe Scotty, but I want to be sure I get this across. If the U.S. would start providing oil to those nations,
Yeah,
yeah, then to India, and also you're right, Scott, to Western Europe, then they'd have another place to turn to. And as a result, now what you can see is that Russia and China are both hugely dependent upon other nations. Whereas the United States, particularly if it gets back into industrialization, all that more and more like it was doing, it would be more self-sufficient. Was that what you were going to say, Scott?
yeah, and
Yeah.
also the timing of everything too. Like Europe, they when it gets wintertime, I mean, you can't even talk about like flipping that switch because
Yeah.
everybody would freeze to death.
They'd freeze to death. Yeah. You know, so the point being then that if things continue the way they're going and what there's a high probability, I think, of the United States coming out on top, and its currency thereby coming out on top, and thereby, even though there's so much more dollars floating around out there in the world, the dollar would become stronger. So that's an interesting scenario to watch, I think.
Well, you got Saudi Arabia too that you got to start. You got to control.
Well, the thing is, if the U.S. starts producing all the oil and gas that they could, then that's all of a sudden Saudi Arabia is a non-issue, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, oh, by the way, before we get in, any further, it's Mother's Day. So I want to wish happy Mother's Day to all the mothers, and Scotty to Ann Louise, and then so many mothers in our little niche of friends here that were close with Batista, Haley. Once you start making a list, you forget somebody, so I better stop right there. But just happy Mother's Day, you know. So let's take a look at the next major step in human evolution and what that's about. Well, as we've said over and over in different podcasts, that people resting into a deeper place within themselves, sort of like you could use the analogy that if our life is a kite and being grounded in the self is the tail of the kite, the more stable and strong the tail is, the higher the kite can soar. And if there's no tail, the kite just spins. And so like that, as the ancient seers have said, you know, enlivening and awakening to that source that dwells deep within all of us, that one thing that's the source of everything, the unified field, if you will. And isn't it incredible that the human physiology is capable of being aware of that level? Yeah, we all can sense it. We sense our unity with things and our connection with other people and like that. But on a profound level, not just a theoretical level, not just an emotional level, but on a physiological level, we can function from that place of unity. That's the wonder of the human nervous system. And it's the result of evolution. You know, the physiology evolves, it grows, it develops, and it starts to embody more and more of its own true nature, you know, on the surface of life. But now, and you know, the most powerful tool that is meditation for the individual, and also this idea of building these powerful unified field generators, which is the Vedic technology we've talked about and what we're developing here at Mount Soma. And according to the Ancient Seers, if we just got what we're trying to build here at Mount Soma, if that just got completed, it would enliven that level so much that it would transform society for the better. That source of infinite intelligence, harmony, that lies at the source of everything. You see? Now, but now let's take a look at the surface of life and what the surface of life would look like as that value got enlivened more and more. And oh, it's just easy to say, you know, when everything is all hunky dory and everything's just fine and stuff, we all get along, we smile, we're all happy together. Uh, but what happens when things become trying, when conflict or when difficulties arise? You know, there was a guy who came to Mount Soma. This was, I don't know, I'm guessing 5 years ago. It was a while ago. And he said, oh, yeah, he said, I used to live in California in a spiritual community, but it collapsed. And I was like, oh, really? I said, well, why did it collapse? And he said, because people fought. I thought it was a really interesting comment at the time. And so we will have disagreements and stuff. But the question becomes, how do we deal with that? And what's the key to dealing with that responsibly? Well, it's remaining grounded in the self. And what is the self? Well, on the surface level, it's one thing, but in the depth, it's that transcendental level, that place where you are one with everything. So it's like unity in the midst of diversity, functioning from the place of unity while still dealing with the field of polar opposites. But people aren't really usually very capable of doing that. People fight. They develop biases. They develop prejudices. They develop righteous indignation. You know, and so much that's the place they function from. And it happens within family unit. It happens within communities. It certainly happens internationally, and that's the stuff that wars are made out of. And why is it? It's because people can't come from that deeper place within and then talk responsibly. Now, I've been teaching for 20 years, over 20 years. I had my own school here for over 20 years. I've been teaching prior to that. But one thing I saw is that people can hear all this stuff, and even profound spiritual concepts and Vedic concepts and stuff. And oh yeah, that's great. Oh, this I've been waiting to hear this my whole life. This is great, you know. But when it comes to living it, it goes right out the window. Because you see, it's not just the concept. It's having it integrated so firmly in the physiology that it's just natural and spontaneous. And so there are a couple of things I thought I'd bring up that'll help illustrate this. And I think the only way we can really get it illustrated is if we get our own buttons pushed a little bit and see where we go. Can we maintain that place of discernment, that place of wisdom within our own self while we get into these more challenging topics? Now, we're going to do a couple of exercises. The exercises are going to be a lot easier than they would be if we weren't prefacing it with everything we just said. Because I'll tell you, as soon as this podcast is over, you're going to get in a situation where somebody's somewhere, probably sooner rather than later. And the question becomes, well, do you practice it then? Or did you hear that and you get it? And so you're a spiritual being, and now you're going to go out and live your life. And then you get into the conflicts. You see, one is an attitude, and others establishing it in your being. And so the first thing I thought I'd talk about is this whole exercise one. Let's talk about this issue that's up with the Supreme Court now, abortion. You know, you got the pro-life and you got the pro-choice, and they're at odds. People are picketing in front of Supreme Court justices' homes. And the nasty things they say about, you know, the pro-life says about the abortion rights and vice versa. It's just, it's inflammatory. It's not constructive. And so what that does is it creates such a huge separation and polarization that it's like, you know, there's no resolution. They're just angry and rageful and judgmental. And so let's just try to take a step back here and let's look at the whole dynamic a little bit. And so let's look at the extreme pro-life and the extreme pro-choice. the extreme pro-life might say, or does say, that, well, in the extreme, it's like, well, life begins, they say at conception, some even say before conception. Contraception is a sin, you know. And then, of course, a little further towards the center, if you will, they might say, well, it's at conception. So, you know, the minute that conception occurs, that's it, that's life, and so abortion's out. The other extreme would be pro-choice. And that, well, in the alter extreme, which is hard for me to even repeat, you got what is called infanticide, where they, you know, once the baby's born, there's a little window there where even after the baby's born, they can kill it. But that even, or a day before the baby is to be delivered, well, abortion is still okay, you know? And so you got these two huge extremes. And I don't think that's where 99.9% of the population is. They're somewhere in between there. And so the question then, in one sense, everybody's pro-life. We're all pro-life. I mean, for one, even the name is inflammatory. Anti-life, nobody's anti-life, everybody's pro-life. And at some point, even, you know, when that fetus is so developed that it could be, the child could be born in the next few hours, I think very few people are anything but totally pro-life, you know? And so even calling them pro-life, it's implying the other people are anti-life. Nobody's anti-life. And the other thing about pro-choice, well, nobody's anti-choice at some point, you know. If people want to make a baby, it's their choice, you know. And contraception, I think 99.99% of the population, okay, pro-choice. So we're all pro-choice and we're all pro-life. It's this in-between zone where things get complicated. And then, of course, there's the issue. I have this one friend, wonderful person, one of my favorite people in the world, I think. And he's totally pro-life. And so we were talking one day, and I said, I'm just wondering, you know, if you had a young teenage daughter and she was raped by some, you know, horrible, I don't know what, you know, criminal, lowlife, I don't know how you want to say it, that would be politically correct, but and he raped her and she got pregnant, would you want her to be able to get an abortion, at least, you know, very, very early on? And he said, definitely. Okay, so the point being, then we have these other things about rape, incest, life of the child, life of the mother. If is the fetus healthy, or is it going to be born with some kind of abnormality or whatever? So all that, I wouldn't want to have to make all those decisions, I'll tell you. But nevertheless, they come into the mix, and so it's within that domain where when it comes to making laws, so much has to be weighed, and we have to keep our balance, because lines are going to have to be drawn. And where do we draw those lines? Is it after the first trimester? Is it like in France after the first, I think it's 12 weeks in France? You know, when does it cease to be okay? You know? And then there's another argument that says that, well, the soul doesn't enter the body sometimes until even after the baby's born. I don't know how you judge that. I mean, midwives, I understand, will testify to that. They'll even say that sometimes they feel like, you know, even after the child is born, the soul hasn't quite entered yet. But concurrently with that, they'll say, and it's been my experience, that even, you know, when you're planning on having a child, or maybe even the very, very beginning of the pregnancy, before you even know if there's a pregnancy going on or not, you just feel the presence of a soul floating around, you know, and I'm certainly not alone in that, you know. So what does that constitute with respect to abortion laws? So these are areas that we really need to maintain our balance in and be established in that self. And though we can't really be fully established in the self until it's a physiological reality, we can still, by trying to avoid inflammatory comments and picketing and rioting and just things that just agitate the whole thing out of proportion, so we can't make a rational decision. So there's one other thing I'd want to say about abortion. And, you know, if you haven't been triggered yet by anything that we said, then this exercise isn't working. So maybe this will trigger you. And that is the idea of states' rights. You know, it's really clearly delineated in the Constitution. What is it? 10th Amendment, Scotty, right? It says that anything that's not clearly delineated as a right to the federal government, that right of creating laws and that goes to the state. And abortion is not mentioned in the Constitution at all, which means that the right would go to the state, to the states, and they'd make up their own laws. And really that, I'm pretty sure that's Justice Alito, I understand, is the one that wrote that, proposed this new idea about getting rid of Roe versus Wade because of the federal government had no right to make that law in the first place. It should go to the states. And boy, does that set off a whole spiral of controversy, you know? Because it's been around for how long has it been? 60, 70 years? I don't know. And the idea then, in such a delicate situation is, you know, this topic, if you're going to correct that, and it was a mistake, they had no legal right to do that. They could have made an amendment to the Constitution, but that was never done. And so then, you know, really by law, it should have never gone to the federal government. And this for me goes beyond, now I'm speaking personally here, beyond the whole issue of abortion. I think the federal government has been trampling all over all kinds of states' rights for decades. And I don't care for it. You know, I don't think, and I'm not talking about abortion here, I'm just talking about in general. I don't think it makes any sense for somebody in New York, because New York and California, if it becomes a federal thing and they vote on a federal level, then they're going to be able to tell people in Alabama or Oklahoma or Montana or whatever what laws they need to abide by. It's too big a country for that, and there's too much diversity in different provinces and different areas of the nation. You know, the laws in Italy are different from the laws in India, and I think rightfully so. You know, and then I could get off on the tangent of international law. International law is an amazing thing, because what happens when you have dealings between these diametrically opposed, philosophically speaking countries?
And Michael, how about the other aspect of this whole thing too, is that, you know, are they doing this right now? What's the motivation behind bringing this up right now?
Good point.
You know, and you know, that can trigger more things too. It's like, okay, you know, what are they trying to?
Yeah, because are they making such a big point out of it now because the Democrats are doing the pro-choice, pushing that agenda all the way to the point of you know, day before the child's born they could abort. You know, but the thing is, there's a whole pro-choice movement there, and so they're going to ride that momentum. Why? Because they believe in it, or because it'll get them votes? I think that's what you're saying, Scotty. Yeah. So that's another huge point. Okay. So all I'm saying is that whatever the subject is, be it abortion or be it anything else, we got to keep our balance. We have to be rational. And also there are laws of the land. They're there for a reason, and we have the ability to change them. And really, if there was a mistake made with respect to, you know, not being able to maintain that the right toward abortion, it would have been that they should have made an amendment to the Constitution 50 years ago, and they never did, which is they just kind of let it go, you know, so that at least the thing was legal. All right, so that's exercise one. If I haven't stirred you up yet, let's try this one out. I got a new book for you. And the title, unless I decide to change it, the title is Conspiracy Theory. Keep in mind, this is an exercise. And Conspiracy Theory is a book. It starts out with this guy who is a journalist who's old time. He's been there for decades, very well connected, and did a lot with Wall Street. And then what happened was the Occupy Wall Street movement, Scotty, remember that? When was that?
I don't know. It was a while ago.
Yeah, it was in the 90s, I think. Yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Anyway,
Occupy Wall Street. So what happened is he got a bunch of what would you call them? Liberals, I guess, who were anti-money, anti-Wall Street. And they all went down to Wall Street in New York, downtown, and just camped out, tented, obstructed all the activity of the Wall Street financials, you know? And so what happened then is that the big businesses that were losing tons of money because they couldn't really operate as they were, started to negotiate with some of the representatives from the Occupy Wall Street movement. In fact, this was even talked about in that book, Woke Inc. Evidently, there's truth to it. But at any rate, what happened then is that companies like Walmart, or I don't know who, Coca-Cola, or I don't know what companies, started giving money to these Occupy Wall Street groups just to get them to back off and not hassle them so that they could continue to conduct their business. And out of that birthed things like Black Lives Matter, which I think now over time it's become clear that the leaders of Black Lives Matter were more about the money they were making than about civil rights. But at any rate, and Antifa, you know, and they started funding these groups. And so you look at it and, you know, why in the world would somewhere like Walmart fund Antifa? I'm not sure Walmart funded Antifa or not, but some of these huge companies did. And it just becomes kind of mind-boggling. So anyway, there's in the book, there's this journalist, this seasoned journalist who was well connected, and he saw this going on, and he saw the motivations behind it, and he saw what it was doing to the nation. And from that, this whole extreme left, centered mostly in San Francisco and California, you know, started gaining momentum, and they had the money to do it. And so they started the, you know, riots in Seattle and Portland, and look what's happened to San Francisco. And and then what happened was, and this started a long time ago, back in the even 60s and 70s. And it really, I think, you see, think about it. Think about all the money that is being spent on drugs in this country, fentanyl alone. But all these drugs are pouring in, and it really started in, I mean, it's been around forever, but it really started up big time and infiltrating the middle class and upper class and more, I think, in the 60s and 70s with the Flower Children and the hippie movement and Haight-Ashbury and all that. And then what happened is that hyper-liberal mentality, because what happens, these people would get stoned or whatever and sit around in their ivory towers, you know, listening to Hendrix and thinking about the way the world should be. And that infiltrated the educational system, the professors as well as the students, the universities, the law schools, which are hyper liberal. And this guy in the book, this seasoned journalist, is witnessing all that and remembering all that. And he starts, you know, becoming a bit of a whistleblower on the whole thing. And then there's this young journalist woman who he kind of, you know, starts working with. Like, they know one another from, you know, companies they've worked for and that. And he starts getting targeted. because see what happened too is that China jumped on this bandwagon because China was making tons of money and giving tons of money to politicians and companies like Nike and Walmart and Coca-Cola are all making tons of money off of China. So China jumped into this thing. So you got kind of like this collusion between politicians, educational systems, Wall Street, extremist groups, Black Lives Matter, Antifa. And then George Soros jumped in on that bandwagon because he saw the opportunity to bring down different economic systems and bet on the currencies and make a ton of money. And then, I mean, you even see quotes of George Soros. I saw a video of him. He says, "I don't care about the morals of anything I do." He says, "It's purely money," you know? And so anyway, you get this whole conglomerate dynamic going. And this guy's witnessing it. So he tells this young woman journalist about it, but he says, you gotta lay low with this. He says, "I don't want your name out there." He says, "because they're gunning for me. And I don't want them gunning for you. So you know this, you can create a little group of people, but don't get affiliated with the big news media or what do they call it? Social networking, you know, because they're all in on it now and they'll come after you." So it becomes a story then of this young woman and a few people, other journalists, young journalists that she bands with that set up shop in like they don't even want to be in a major company. So they're off in a rural, semi-rural area somewhere, living in a house, working out of a house, that is, and researching all this stuff via the connections that this older journalist provided with him before he actually did get knocked off. They killed him. And so that's how the story goes. And then it takes a look at all sorts of current events. And of course, throughout the book, we don't use the word Ukraine. We use, some other word, and we don't use the name George Soros. Probably don't, but it's all based on these. Call it a conspiracy theory. Some people call it conspiracy theory. Other people would say, well, this is just historical fact, and then you got the whole disinformation thing going. And so it's a kind of an expose in a novel form. Would even make a good TV series, wouldn't it, Scott?
For sure.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting. And the thing is, some people might look at it and consider it a really good, exciting adventure. It's kind of like the TV show 24. Who was the guy in 24? Yeah, it'd be like that kind of an exciting sort of a TV series, but it's purely fantasy from that perspective. Others might almost see it as a docudrama kind of a thing, but it wouldn't matter because it would be an incredibly compelling book or TV series or whatever, no matter what side of the thing you're on. But what's going to happen now, and I want to say this again, is that post World War II, I think, was an interesting time. In fact, and also pre World War II. Pre-World War II, kind of like roaring 20s, and then led into this kind of carefree thing before the Depression with all the money people were making and the Charleston and then there was this great sobering with the Depression. It was a great sobering. And then World War II, of course, was another horrible thing. And then post-World War II, the United States rose to the top, and but people now have become sobered up. And so it became a time of great productivity. There's a movie called, if you haven't seen this movie, I don't see it. It's a really good movie, Cinderella Man with Russell Crowe. You've seen that, Scotty, I'm sure.
Yeah.
There's a great line in there when they were interviewing, the press was interviewing James Braddock as the star. He was a real life character, boxer, and he was down and out, and he wasn't very successful. But then the Depression hit, and he couldn't feed his kids, and everybody was suffering. And so somebody once in an interview asked James Braddock, it's shown in the movie, what changed? What happened? He said, what? And James Braddock looked back at the guy and he said, milk.
Yeah.
And to me, that was such a compelling commentary on the history of humanity in a way. Was that there's this sobering period, and we're going through one now, no question about it. When people get back to basics, they get back to what's real. They start to realize the value of milk, and what underlies that is what? Just what we were talking about, Scotty, the currency, you
Right.
know? And it really looks like I think there's a good probability to the fact that the US dollar is going to bounce back for all the reasons we just gave. And there's going to be a great sobering, which will lead into a new time, another generation then of prosperity with the United States. But through the United States, I mean, Europe benefited greatly from, even though the United States arguably was on top. And I think the whole world then will prosper. And I think that's what we have coming. So really, in a very pragmatic, real sense now, I'd say, hang in there. We're going through a great sobering process, and there's a lot of craziness going on. But it's going to get sorted out. And it's going to be 2-3 years before we're really starting to take off again. But we'll start to see signs of it sooner than that. And so I know, gosh, I hear from so many people that they're having a hard time. Life is really difficult these days. And I just want to encourage you to hang in there. Things are going to get better. Things are going to get great. We're coming into an age of tremendous prosperity. Here I could go on and on. The technology is another thing. Tech is we're on the verge of great industrial revolution based largely in tech. And that's going to bring such a huge wave of prosperity to the world. It's just going to be fabulous. Okay, that's all I got for now. And we'll talk with you all again next week. Anything else, Scotty, before we close?
No, I think that's good.
Okay, great.
Everybody.
Thanks for listening.